Well, the first thing, of course, that happened, we lost 100 men in our regiment, killed or wounded. So that was the biggest shock of all. We knew something was going to happen, but we had no idea that many men would be killed or wounded. And then, of course, the next day it didn't make any difference. You just knew that somebody was killed, or Bill was killed, Jim was killed. You didn't pay much attention. It was just complicated.
Much has been written about the Normandy landings, but little is known about the massacres that occurred on that same land. It involved the execution of around 156 Canadian soldiers, who were eliminated by a faction of the German forces that had taken them prisoner in June 1944, shortly after the beginning of the invasion on the beaches of northern France. The murders, which took place in various hideouts in the region, are one of the worst war crimes committed against the Canadian Army in modern history. What is most surprising is that all of this happened at the beginning of the fall of the Nazi regime, following the legendary D-Day operation. In this video, we will tell you about the identity of the perpetrators, their justifications for carrying out the massacre, and an incredible story of redemption. Don't move from your screens for this new installment of military history. Let's begin. On June 6, 1944, the Battle of Normandy began, with 3.5 million soldiers from both sides taking part, and it would continue until late August of that year. Allied troops landed on the northern French coast and then advanced inland, conducting a campaign to defeat the German forces opposing them. Later, they turned east, specifically towards Belgium, the Netherlands, and the German border. The official casualty figures from this military endeavor still send chills down the spine. It is estimated that around 625,000 people died, both among the Allies and the Germans, but it may be more. On Omaha Beach alone, which was the toughest stretch of the operation, 43,500 Americans and 12,000 Germans died. There was a unit that lost 90% of its men in the first wave. However, beyond the battles, there was a completely ruthless and inhumane massacre suffered by Canadian prisoners of war. The soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division of that country landed on Juno Beach and in the days and weeks that followed, fought a series of difficult battles in the countryside south of the region against a rather peculiar German regiment.
We were sent in as a sacrifice to try and stop the advance of the German 12th Panzer
formed as Adolf Hitler's personal armed guard. The combination of fanatic Nazi teenagers and non-commissioned officers who had fiercely
and he could speak English quite well. And he says, I don't know why you were taken prisoner. I'll tell you what, I was so scared that all of a sudden I just thought, I won't even hear the gun go off.
2nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered 60 kilometers along the Danube, arriving much earlier than Hitler's troops expected. It was Sunday noon, the camp was completely quiet, and the SS guards were on duty, monitoring the movements of the prisoners still in the camp from their towers. A heartrending cry broke the calm of the day: "The Americans! The Americans!" A prisoner ran towards the door, in a vain attempt to attract the attention of the soldiers, but one of the guards shot him in the back, killing him instantly. Either way, it wasn't necessary. The US infantry had caught sight of the Dachau towers, and began firing at the German officers. The SS members, finding themselves vastly outnumbered, decided to step down from their posts and surrender unconditionally. After the first two guards knelt, an American soldier approached and, without a second thought, executed them on the spot using his pistol. Thus would begin a bloody day, remembered as one of the greatest war crimes of the United States during World War II. Join us in a new episode of Military History to learn all about the terrible Dachau massacre, when American soldiers mercilessly murdered German prisoners of war. But before continuing, we want to introduce you to our new channel, Military Might. Here we'll explore the extraordinary world of the armed forces, armored vehicles, weapons of mass destruction, and the most important military conflicts of today. You'll find the link to subscribe in the description of the video and in the first comment. Are you ready? Let's get started. Captain Wilsey believed he was prepared for anything. He was part of the 7th Army of the United States, and had even participated in the landing in Normandy. As an anesthesiologist, a fundamental part of the medical corps, he witnessed the harshest images of the battle. Since entering Europe, he had assisted thousands of fallen soldiers, with the most terrible injuries, although most of them died clinging to the anesthesiologist's hand, while feeling the warm embrace of morphine as the last relief. Captain Wilsey believed that he was prepared for anything, that he had already seen the greatest atrocities of the war, until he entered Dachau. As soon as he passed through the barred portals that separated barbarism from the rest of the world, he could not help but remain motionless while he traversed the sinister panorama. Piles of skeletal corpses, a mixture of death caused by malnutrition with long exposure to the elements and the sun during decomposition. Piles of shoes and prisoner uniforms accumulated in sheds, which had just been removed from those sentenced to death, to be reused in the next litter of inmates who entered the camp. The ovens where they burned the bodies of the victims and removed the evidence of the genocide smoked at full speed. But even worse was with the living. The remaining prisoners, more than 30,000 people who were in subhuman conditions, looked like the walking dead. Completely devastated by starvation and lack of water, toothless due to poor sanitation and lack of personal hygiene rooms. Wilsey, like his American colleagues, could not really understand how such a scenario could possibly exist anywhere in the world. Somehow, the captain understood what his companions did the days following April 29, 1945, although the whole situation left him with serious psychological consequences that accompanied him for the rest of his days. But thanks to him, today we know the details of what is known as the Dachau massacre. The massacre began, as we mentioned before, with the first guards who surrendered in the face of the arrival of the 2 battalions of U.S. infantry. But this had been an isolated incident, until the Americans finally entered the camp. Tower B, the second lookout post, was also the scene of a systematic shooting of German guards who, after surrendering, were forced to kneel and shot in the head. Lieutenant Walsh captured 4 German soldiers, forced them into a freight car containing some 120 Jewish corpses, and, after keeping them there for a while, murdered them in cold blood. Some 12 POWs were later gunned down in a coal yard by a 19-year-old gunner, who was found by Colonel Sparks in deep shock, crying and screaming that they had tried to escape. Before the end of the first day, madness gripped the men at Dachau. After a long time, towards the end of his life, Wilsey attributed the macabre events to a kind of delirium tremens. According to him, the horrors that the American soldiers had to witness, added to the stress of the war, were too much for them. On the morning of the second day, the Americans forced some 50 SS soldiers to strip naked in the open and give the Nazi salute, arm raised to the sun, while buckets of ice water were thrown at them. This practice had been carried out by the guards themselves with the Jews and other prisoners previously. However, there was the condition that if they lowered their arms for whatever reason, they would be executed. The 50 Germans were shot to death before noon. In letters from the date of the events, the anesthesiologist spoke of the massacre as something logical. In one of his letters you can read, "I saw how my companions captured an SS soldier who had been tortured and then coldly shot him. God forgive me, but I watched it without being disturbed by emotion after knowing the actions that the beasts of the SS had carried out against their prisoners." Really, he wasn't the only one who had this in mind. Some members of the 7th Army of the United States, invoking a certain spirit of revenge, decided to give their rifles to the Jews in better health, so that they could guard the German prisoners in the way they saw fit. The men, who had been dehumanized, abused, tortured and humiliated for so long, soon unleashed a small carnage. They entered the camp hospital, where they murdered dozens of SS officers, as well as conventional German troops. They also directed their hatred against the capos, other prisoners who had higher status and wielded the power of guards among the prisoners themselves. Many of them were beaten to death or executed in the barracks. Within days, the Dachau massacre had been consummated. Although the official figures, accepted by the United States government, suggest that the German prisoners killed were between 50 and 100, some other sources indicate that they could have reached more than 500. General Eisenhower celebrated the liberation of the camp and reported that 32,000 prisoners had been released, while U.S. troops had killed some 300 enemies. The conditions in which these deaths occurred, however, became known almost 70 years later. The orders were clear: exterminate all the prisoners. With this blunt phrase, on December 13, 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army began one of the cruelest massacres in history in the Chinese city of Nanking. This event occurred within the framework of a war between China and Japan known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began 2 years before World War II, and is considered the most terrible war crime of the century. The horror was of such magnitude that specialists have come to affirm that if the hands of those killed in this massacre were joined, it would be possible to travel the distance that separates Nanking from the city of Hangzhou, equivalent to 200 kilometers. That their stacked bodies could reach the height of a 74-story building, and that their blood would weigh 1,200 tons. The worst part of that indescribable hell was suffered by the female inhabitants of Nanking. That ordeal, whose responsibility is the sole responsibility of the Japanese Imperial Army, is what we are going to tell you about in this video. Crimes against humanity are usually associated with the Third Reich, but the massacre committed by Japan in Nanking is an aberrational episode that cost the lives of more than 300,000 people. Yet this is a tragedy that has been largely omitted from the history books and, outrageously, the Japanese government has never publicly apologized for such an atrocity that took place over the course of 42 days. We are talking about the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was an invasion of Chinese territory, which began on July 7, 1937, with the support of Nazi Germany, which was about to start World War II. In this context, the campaign to conquer Nanking, at that time the capital of China, took place, in which the Japanese achieved their goal, taking the city and carrying out all kinds of atrocities with local detainees. The horror began with the order to execute the Chinese prisoners of war, with chilling textual indications of how to do it. All prisoners are to be executed. Protocol execution method: divide prisoners into groups of 12. Shoot to kill for separate. As if the directions weren't already inhumane enough, the Japanese military, completely unleashed, pushed the directives even further, entering homes, banks, and businesses. They looted everything in their path, randomly opening fire without hesitation, executing people from behind, from the front or straight to the heart. During the Japanese invasion, cruelty reached limits that were difficult to overcome, as atrocities ranging from beheading competitions with swords to the savagery of burying prisoners up to their waists to be devoured by wild dogs were committed. The civilian population, but in particular women, old women and girls, were the ones who suffered the most, since it is considered that during the attack on Nanjing one of the largest collective and systematic sexual crimes in history was carried out. It is estimated that around 80,000 women were abused by the Japanese army, to later be murdered in the most brutal ways. In Nanking, the killing of Chinese women by the Japanese army seemed like a purge plan with a clear objective. The soldiers did a door-to-door search to find the victims, who were taken by force. It did not matter their age or if they were pregnant. All the prisoners were killed immediately after being abused, generally by inhumane means ranging from mutilation, in which their breasts were cut off, or by stabbing them with weapons in their private parts. According to data from the investigations, during the invasion of the Japanese army, there were at least 1,000 cases of violations per night and as many during the day. Records of missionaries of the time in the territory leave chilling testimonies. There is probably no crime that has not been committed in this city today. 30 girls were taken from the language school and from their homes yesterday afternoon, some of whom were as young as 12 years old. Also tonight, we heard a truck full of prisoners go through the door of the newspaper, in which there were at least 8 or 10 girls screaming for help from the back of the vehicle. This statement is from Minnie Vautrin, and was taken from her personal diary on December 16, 1937. More evidence of the cruelty of the imperial troops were found in the letters that Dr. Robert O. Wilson, an American surgeon who was working in the city, sent to his family to tell of the tragedy. Let me recount some cases that occurred in the last 2 days. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was destroyed and 2 of his relatives, 2 girls around 16 years old, were raped to death in one of the refugee camps. At University Middle School, where there are 8,000 people, the Japanese jumped over the wall, stole food, clothes, and abused women until they were satisfied. As this testimony shows, the behavior of the Japanese soldiers did not respond to a war strategy to conquer the territory, but more to pure cruelty. According to witnesses who survived the Nanking massacre, no woman was safe from sexual exploitation. In some cases, such attacks were filmed as macabre souvenirs, and all ended with the victim being murdered. Imperial troops, moving in small numbers for freedom, continued to prowl the devastated towns, violating the women and girls, and killing anyone who tried to resist. The most ruthless and savage thing about this whole situation was that there were girls under the age of 8 and old women over 70, attacked in the most brutal way possible, showing that the Japanese soldiers had no mercy for the Chinese people. In the midst of this completely inhuman situation, it seemed impossible for anything similar to a resistance to appear, but this type of situation opens the door to unexpected characters in the story. That was the case with Chang Benhua, a resistance hero who fought against the Japanese during the Nanking massacre. She became known through a photo in which she was portrayed shortly before she was assassinated by the Japanese army. This Oriental girl has become an iconic image of bravery and resistance for the entire Chinese people, and her story is as moving as her tragic ending. Chang Benhua was born in the small village of Gaoxiang, in the Anhui province, in the eastern part of China, in the year 1914. She grew up as a brave, intelligent and firm woman in her own convictions. Still in high school, she joined a local scout group, where she would receive strict military training that would serve her years later to fight the Japanese. In 1937, Benhua, who was only a 23-year-old girl, became an active figure in the anti-Japanese national movement, a group made up of volunteer guerrillas that would consolidate as a united army in 1936. In that same year, Chang would marry his friend, recruit and partner, Liu Ziyi, and both would end up joining the People's Self-Defense Force to fight against the Japanese invasion. The courage, temper and leadership skills of the young Chinese girl would end up placing her in command of some troops of her organization.
1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937 1937
Despite the efforts of Cheng and his compatriots, the resistance was defeated by the imperial army and thousands of prisoners were taken, including Benhua and her partner. Testimonies from the resistance say that, ignoring the enemy's attempts to persuade her to surrender, Cheng did not back down in the face of a much larger army, which aroused the visceral hatred of the Japanese soldiers. As a consequence of her actions, she would be locked up in prison or she would go through a true ordeal. Unsurprisingly, Cheng's stay in jail was hell, as she was repeatedly abused and humiliated during her brief prisoner period. Among the acts of cruelty to which she was subjected, it stands out that she was forced to witness the execution of her companions, while she was violated by a group of Japanese soldiers. Despite everything, Cheng maintained her impassive and defiant attitude, showing an iron spirit, unable to break. That's why in the photo that made her a legend, she seems to defy death with a smile, as she carries her arms crossed over her chest and her head upright to look directly at the camera without blinking. Despite her boundless courage, the girl was finally executed by bayonet in December 1938, at the young age of 24. The image of her, in which she showed a challenging and strong attitude, ended up becoming famous all over the world, being, especially for the Chinese people, an icon of patriotic value. Cheng Benhua, who faced death with a smile, will remain one of the bravest fighters in history. Her pose in that famous shot is commemorated by a 5-meter statue in Nanjing, also the site of one of the worst war crimes, where 300,000 Chinese men, women and children were massacred by Japanese troops. If you found this story interesting, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any military history videos.